when the war started, or?
Yes, I joined in 1938, and so when the war started, I was posted to a heavy gun cruiser, HMS Norfolk, and frankly, to a large extent, the story hinges on that. I was the Marine subaltern, and my action station was to sit in the after gun control position. Years later, at the end of the war, I used to complain bitterly about having spent 5 years of my life locked up one way or another, and I then discovered that David Barclay, who had been appointed to relieve me, and he'd gone to the Norfolk, was sitting in the same seat when they met the Bismarck, and terribly unfortunately his head was blown off. Yeah. So I think it was a good trade at the end of it all. However, who knows?
So how did you come to become a guest of the Germans then?
Because the Norfolk was bombed in Scapa Flow in March of 1940, had to go into dock at Guruk for repair, and they sent the sailors and the Marines off to their various depots for retraining and whatever they could think of, which caused us to be hacking around in Chatham barracks waiting for the sort of recall to the Norfolk. And then one night the General Assembly blew. I don't think it's a going concern today. Modern communications would probably have blocked it. But all the bugles started sounding, and what it meant was that everybody dropped what they were doing and had to go and fall in on the main parade. And you got the cooks and the bootmakers and the colonel and the brigadier and everybody out there. And this was in May of 1940, and we were told that they were forming what was called a Calais force, which was going to go to Calais to supervise or assist in the demolition of the docks. And there was a naval demolition party who we didn't meet till the other end, and so we were stuck into a fleet of East Kent buses. Again, in those days we had no transport of our own, so it had to be buses, and we drove off to darkest Dover, went into the Citadel, I think it was called the Citadel, it's sort of the main castle in Dover, and the next morning we were embarked on one of the old B&W class destroyers, HMS Verity, and the idea being that we all had to sort of sit around on the upper deck with boxes of ammunition and things so that we could jump ashore. When we arrived in Calais it was pitch dark, but the sky was brightened by shell blasts and things going off all the time. And by then we were getting fairly tired, and we'd been running around for 24 hours doing nothing much, and I went and sat on a big heap of sacks somewhere, and it was only about after I'd been sitting there for a while I discovered that these were bodies which had come out of a hospital train, and I was taking my ease on them, so I got off from that one. And so it went on. Calais was a difficult scene. I've always questioned the judgment, and it's terribly easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to be smart and think, well, I would have done it differently. The brigadier there, who I think possibly also had similar views, subsequently did not survive the war. He was in a prison camp in Spangenberg, I think, and he died, I think, at his own hand. But that, I think he was, well, he would have to have questioned himself all along. And then that well-known British politician who I despise incredibly, Anthony Eden, came on a loudspeaker, and they had some destroyers running up and down the coast just off the shoreline, broadcasting, "The eyes of the Empire are on you, do not surrender." And at the same time, the unfortunate brigadier in the background was sort of telling us that we should surrender, so we were rather doubtful as to which one to obey. Since I later suffered from Anthony Eden in Suez, at the Suez debacle, I've really never had much time for him. He was a vacillating politician. That was his problem. So anyway, that got us captured, and that was on a Sunday, 26th of May, 1940.
And then you were presumably sent off to a camp in Germany? Well,
if you're told sent off, it sounds as though the buses were brought along and the cabs and things, and you were given a ticket and went. In fact, there was a sharp thing on the end of a rifle called a bayonet, which was stuck up your backside, and you had to shuffle off, and we walked or marched a very great deal of the way. I've always had some respect for the bootmakers. In those days, young officers had to buy their own kit, and we had to go to a bootmaker in London who made the boots. And I will say this for him: mine stood up remarkably well. They stood up the whole of the war, walking in and walking out.
Really?
It's these small, insignificant details which I think show that perhaps the old system wasn't a bad one after all.
So you walked.
We walked
to Germany.
We walked to, I think it was Mainz and Trier, which are two sort of fortress towns, and we went through a number of French places. I've never been terribly pro-French, because at that time one saw large numbers of French officers who were sort of wearing their number one dress and had large suitcases packed, sort of standing on the corner, thumbing to go into Germany. In other words, they were volunteers to be prisoner, and it probably accounts for the fact that I stay away from most French products except their wine, which my doctor tells me is good for me.
That's right. So you finished up where, in fact, in Germany?
We went to Trier, where we were stuck into a railway train which took us to Regensburg, and from Regensburg we went to Laufen, which was Oflag 7C, and in Laufen it must have been a sorting out period. How the hell the German sort of administration took care of it, I don't know. They managed to interview probably most of us, and they were, I would think, figuring out in their own way how they would deal with this large number of prisoners they hadn't expected. And we were in things like 5-stacker bunks, but the conditions weren't bad. So you really can't complain. And then we were taken to, from there, just before Christmas. Now, it must have been in about October. We were taken in 1940 to another camp called Tetmonning, and there was a delightful guy from the Bays called Crash Keyworth, and Crash wrote to his brother saying, we passed a cow in a field with one tit moaning gently. He thought that somebody would catch on to tit moaning from that. I don't think it had happened, and I don't know what they'd have done about it if they had figured it out. But and I then had my 21st birthday in tit moaning, which was organised by the what was the fellow's name then? Charlie Hopetown. Anyhow, from there we went to the naval camp, and which was Melag Nord, which was up in the north of Germany, between Bremen and Bremerhaven.
That was Sandborstel, was it?
Sandborstel, yes. And about 3 months ago, we suddenly got excited. We were told, I still work in Freeport, Bahamas, and we were told that some of the business people were going to be invited to Bremerhaven for a reception by Lloyd Werft, who were about to operate a ship care facility in Freeport. And before they came, it was thought that quite a lot of us would go there. I jumped at it because although I had to pay for my own fares and hotel and everything else, I thought it would give me a chance to have a look at Sandborstel again. My wife wrote to the local tourist board. I can't think what tourism had to do with it, but still. And, they apparently had some information. And suddenly at the last minute it was all cancelled. And we now discover that Lloyd Werft are not taking on the job, and somebody else is.
So you never got to see Sandborstel?
Never went back there. I've never been back to, well, I've been back to Colditz. I've been back there twice or maybe 3 times.
So in Sandborstel you got involved with the scheme of Hugh Bruce's, I believe?
Yes. Well, I never knew whose scheme it was. All I knew, I was an obedient subaltern.
Sorry about that.
Hugh Bruce and Bosun Crisp, who you heard the thing from, sort of organised the tunnel. I feel sure that there were other people involved, but my sort of friendship lay with Hugh Bruce, and I sort of took my orders from him. And again, in hindsight, it was a remarkably well executed escape attempt. You had a hell of a distance of dead flat ground to go. You had a tall wire fence which there was no chance of getting over because it had all sorts of warning cables, and every 100 yards or so there was a guard tower, and they were up there with lights and machine guns, and they also had sort of posterns of dogs which they could let loose if they thought something was happening. So to actually get out of there was, I think, fortunate. It wasn't actually fortunate, it was extremely well planned, and people like Bosun Crisp, and there were 3 ERAs, engine room artificers, out of the submarines. I've forgotten how many total were involved, but in 2 separate nights we all got out. I think we were the first 2 out because Hugh, having dug the tunnel, we had to go down there and sort of excavate the end a bit and drop the last piece of turf so that we could get out. We then stood at the end and came back out again while other people escaped, and then we went off towards the end of it all.
So the Germans didn't know you'd gone the first day then, if other people got out the second?
That's correct. it was a highly confused piece of camp, because you also had the Melag, which was the international section, which was mainly merchant crews of fleet auxiliaries and other ships, and a heck of a lot of them were Chinese or Arabs, and I don't think that the Germans had any effective method or even bothered much about counting them, and so a few of them were brought in to sort of stand in the roll calls, and I don't think that our escape was noticed for 24 to 36 hours.
When you were at Melag, do you remember ever coming into contact with this chap Purdy?
Yes.
He was actually there, wasn't
he? He was there, and he came there, and I think that we certainly had absolutely no suspicion at that time whatsoever that there was anything strange about him. He just seemed very young and innocent, but then we weren't all that old and experienced either. At that time I was just 21, and I suppose Birdie, I think I saw the other day, was 2 days younger than I was, so you didn't really notice it. That was the first time we met him, and we saw him later.
Then you've got out of the tunnel with Hugh. Can you remember anything of your experience while you were out? Did you have any plans made where you were going?
Oh, where we were going to was Lubeck. I think really we were all very innocent, and we all thought, oh, Lubeck's the place to go. There was a direct line from Lubeck, a shipping line up into Sweden, and there was a thought that one might catch that. Alternatively, it was the nearest sort of relaxed seaport area, and yes, Lubeck was for us, and I think it was the same for everybody. We were in the north of Germany. Nobody was going to shoot for Switzerland or anything, and I have to avoid getting mixed up because we were shortly into a second escape, and the first one we were brought back as they found us, so we were dragged back into the Malag again, and while we were there being interrogated, we still hadn't actually got back into the camp. We were in the outer cells, and I can't think why they took a rather relaxed view of us, and they didn't even lock us in. And I saw a truck approaching from the inside of the camp. It had been unloading stores, and it stood at the gate, and I said, come on Hugh, let's shove off again. And without nobody stopped us, we just walked out, got in the back of the truck, lay down, and after a minute or two it had gone, and we were off and out again, which I think irritated quite a lot of the German security people, because they realised they'd been caught with their pants down. And eventually the truck stopped, and we thought, well, we must be somewhere, we'd better get the hell out of it. And so we jumped out and found we were in the middle of a herd of cows which was ambling down the street, we were out in the middle of the country, Christ knew where. And on that occasion we were aiming not for the port, not for Lubeck. We decided we'd have a go at Denmark. I think that our political rationing was a bit wrong. We had thought that Denmark was neutral, and we had thought all sorts of things, but again we made a classic mistake. Getting to Denmark was all right. We went up to the railway station in Hamburg and bought a ticket and sort of said Neumarkt or wherever it was we wanted to go, and there wasn't a problem. But when we got there, we wanted to identify those rail lines which went north into Denmark and where they appeared to be marshalling goods trains, so that we'd go and sneak down and get into the goods train and hope that the next day we'd be in Denmark. While we were up there, it was a nice sunny afternoon, a gang of German workmen went past, and somebody asked who we were, and we said, oh, we were Danish volunteer workers. Well, of course, they immediately started talking to us in Danish. That didn't do much for us. In other words, that was poor planning, and that got us back again, and we were, I think, fortunate, because when we were taken into Neumarkt, which was a sort of main town, we were still under arrest with military personnel, and then they turned us over to the Gestapo, and we were going back into the main city, whose name escapes me, on the boundary, with a Gestapo sort of guards with us. Very fortunately, in the street we saw a German naval officer, lieutenant commander, in uniform, and I said to Hugh, you divert the guys and I'll go to him. And I ran and sort of put my arms around him, so that if they wanted to shoot me, they'd take him with me. And I told him then that we were British naval officers, that we were concerned about being with the Gestapo, and was there some way he could assist. And about 3 or 4 hours later, we were in a cell, and a petty officer and some sailors came down, and they took charge of us. So I think we were dead lucky there.
Did you speak German?
A little, yes. And it got to a point where I could speak fairly well. I've lost it all again since.
Back to Sandborstel again, did they?
Back to Sandborstel. This time they were a lot more cautious. There were people around us the whole time. There were no doors left unlocked. And I don't think we were in Sandborstel for more than about 10 days, when we were told that as a preliminary manoeuvre, whatever they did with us subsequently, we were being moved to Colditz. They didn't name it, but to a high security prison. And we then started one of these interminable sort of moves around Germany. I think their train system in 1941 must have been rather like our train system today. It was shot to hell. In other words, nothing ever went on time. It took forever, and you had to carry your rations with you, and you sort of sat around a great deal.
The journeys certainly seemed to take a long time, didn't they?
Yeah.
From what people have said, you were in trains for days.
Days, and 7 and 10 days was nothing. To get from, say, to get through to Colditz, they had decided that the best way was to take us to Berlin, and then from Berlin we had to go to somewhere even further to the east, and sort of slope down. And our trip, I haven't researched this, but it could easily be put to a date. It must have been very shortly after the Dieppe raid, because the Dieppe raid put a lot of British and Canadians as prisoners, and we were in a station just outside Berlin, and we saw this long train with written on the side in 2-foot-high letters, Die wollten eine zweiten Front zu machen. Hier sind die. They wanted to make a second front. Here they are. And there were a lot of very unhappy looking guys sitting around in these railway trains.
Can you remember actually arriving at Colditz, and
yes.
What was your first impression of that?
We had been in this place, Lambsdorff, which was a a stalag or dulag, and they sort of stuck us in a train, and we finally hit Colditz, and it was down in the town, was the sort of railway place, and we were formed up there. There were 7 or 8 of us, and marched, and suddenly we hadn't seen it before, the castle, and to this day it's a dramatic looking place, and I think if you had to be in a prison of distinction, Colditz was one. It wasn't exactly frightening, it's just damned impressive. Great big lump of masonry sitting up there, and we went up the hill, and we were slowly sort of went through gate after gate and security point after security point until we reached the sort of main entrance, and then were let into the prison yard where a lot of people sort of saw us coming in, and all came down to find out who we were and where we'd come from, and it was generally quite a welcoming experience once one had got inside the gates, but from outside it was an extremely alarming look. You looked at this place and you thought, well, I ain't never going to get out of here in a hurry.
And that was on, was it the 1st of September 42 you went to Colditz?
I'll take your word for it.
Well, going by the book it was.
It would have been about then, yes. Other things would put that date in, because while we were wandering about a railway station in East Berlin, we saw the first of the troop transport plane coming back from Russia, and it was strange that a day or two previously we had seen the British prisoners from Dieppe going one way. They wanted to start a second front, and here were the returning wounded coming back from Russia, showing things, and they really sent out shockwaves. As far as I was concerned, they quite clearly realised they'd bitten off more than they could chew.
At some stage, I believe you were in, was it Grandenz?
Grandenz, yes. Yeah.
Was that when the Gestapo had you? Or?
No, it was not Gestapo. It was a German military prison camp, exactly the same as, if the name's known, the Glass House. In other words, for military prisoners who had committed military offences. And I was there for about 4 months, and quite frankly, it was a heck of a sight, tougher and much more abrasive in its reaction than Colditz ever was. I was kept in solitary. I was not given anything to read, and it was a much more strenuous sort of thing on one's mind than Colditz. Colditz, one was surrounded by people of one's own sort of age, rank, background, and it, without being light-hearted, it was pretty much a sort of a club atmosphere. Grandenz, there was nobody there. I was the only officer, British officer, in there, and on my second day in, a team came to see me, who were some British prisoners locally. One of them was a sergeant major in the Black Watch, and they sort of told me who they were and tried to find out what I was doing. And then he handed me a parcel, and he said, "You've got to eat this quick. This is cheese." And I said, "Oh, do you make cheese or what?" "We work in the cheese factory here." And he said, "This is the fresh cheese." I said, "How do you mean?" He said, "Well," he said, "we have 2 sorts of cheese. There's the cheese we'll eat and there's the cheese they eat." He said, "All of us," he said, "when we go along in the morning we take a small bottle with us and that's full of piss. And he said, we take a paper bag and that's full of crap. And he said, but we help ourselves to some genuine clean cheese first, and then he said we mix it up for the Germans. So he was really quite an amusing guy. And I saw two others people, one of whom I could call a friend, murdered. He was a flight lieutenant, Thompson, and he had escaped from Grandenz, and he'd gone to, I think it was Gleiwitz, which was a military airfield next door, got into a plane and had sort of made up his mind where he was going, but I think he must have forgotten that just by turning the key doesn't start it. You've got to have someone outside plugging it on, and they arrested him and pulled him out, and he was brought back to Colditz, and that evening, about 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, a man called Stubbs Feldwebel Österreicher came along, and I watched him go into his cell, and apparently what he said to him was, you have damaged the reputation of Grandenz prison. You have put my name on the line because I allowed you to escape, and you can die the hard way. And he shot him in the belly and left him to die. And I think it took him, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours. I could hear him groaning and crying. There was nothing much I could do. I shouted and hollered, but obviously they'd put the clappers on. And he died. And after the war, when we were checked out, they sort of said, are there any war crimes that you can think of? And you had to fill out a form, and I reported the incident, and I don't think it was much more than 2 weeks later I got a letter from some government thing saying, that's one you don't have to worry about. Stubbs Feldwebel Österreicher was picked up by the Germans one day and hanged the next. So just like that. Well, they didn't bother with trials. They knew he was a bad nut, and that was him. And then there was a poor little Italian there, who the Italians changed sides in 1943, I think it was, 43, 44, and this guy was all mixed up, and he was ill. He had some sort of stomach complaint, and they came for him. He was on a stretcher, took him up, put him in an ambulance. They didn't close the doors because the stretcher wouldn't quite fit in, and then they drove off at about 50 miles an hour, oh, woof, and of course the doors flew open and he shot out. The next thing I saw was 2 Germans with bayonets finished him off. They said he was trying to escape because the poor soul was strapped to a stretcher. There was no way he's trying to run. But and years later, about 14 or 15 years ago, the commandant there was an Oberleutnant, somebody beginning with K, and I was looking at houses in the Marbella area to see if I could buy one, and I saw at the inside of a townhouse on the staircase a large picture of somebody, and I thought, I know that guy's face, and I asked, and this was the commandant who'd been in Grandenz. He died shortly afterwards. I never actually met him.
What had you done to be sent to Grandenz?
You talked just now about the Green Jackets. We were with the Green Jacket Brigade in Calais at the beginning, and there was a very determined, great young guy called Sinclair, and his father, I think, had been a regular officer for years in the Green Jackets, and a great deal of family pressure was put on him, and he had escaped, and he was brought back, And then we had all been mixed up with the attempt to escape, because we were minding certain windows, so that if he had succeeded in relieving the guards as he went around, and he got more than halfway relieving the postons as he went, we were then going to escape over the walls and follow him. He was then shot at pretty close range by somebody, and there wasn't any reason. He wasn't armed. Yes, he had a wooden pistol and he was dressed like a German, and I suppose you can forgive anyone, but he was shot in fairly cold blood. And when the parade to sort of count heads and make sure how many were missing took place, I saw Hauptmann Pübke, who in hindsight was a reasonable sort of guy, a big fella, and I went up to him and called him a German murderer, and in German, and he didn't like that very much. And then he tried to sort of catch a hold of me, and I wrestled with him, and of course the guards took me away, and I was charged with striking a German officer and insulting the reputation of the German Wehrmacht by calling them German murderers. That took me to a trial in Leipzig, and during the middle of the trial, or towards the end of it, I had just been sentenced to 2 months hard labour by the judge, when the air raid sirens went off and we all went down into the tunnels, and I found I was sitting, I didn't realise it, I was sitting well within earshot of the judge, and every time I could hear a bomb coming down, you could hear it sort of whistling, and I was shouting, "Hooray!" And then there was a big crash, and I had shouted, "3 cheers for the British Empire." And when we got back up top again, the judge just said, "Your sentence is doubled from 2 months to 4 months." And then bang went the hammer, and off I went.
I remember Pete Tunstall telling me that he was in some sort of a cell with German officers, because they watched an air raid as well.
Yeah.
This was after they were in. But I don't believe that was ground. I don't know where it was.
No, it wouldn't have been. Apart from anything else, Grandenz was quite a long way to the east. It was, today it's called Grandenz, and the Poles have, of course, taken it back. It was
in Poland, wasn't it?
It was in what was called the Wartegau, which was the part of Poland which Hitler had put his eyeball on, and he'd got a hold of it before the war, and it was subject to German law and discipline.
So I was going to ask, I meant to ask when you were talking about it where it was, because I'd never heard of it before.
If you would see it now on a map, it's not called Grandenz, it's called Gdansk, and Gdansk, and it is in to the east of Warsaw. In hindsight, I'm very glad I didn't spend 5 years in Grandenz. It was a much harsher atmosphere, strange place, and I had, because I was an officer, I had what was called a putzer, or a batman, allocated to me, and he was a full colonel in the Luftwaffe, and we sort of chatted along a bit, and he was really quite a nice guy, and I asked him what he was in there for, and it was called Fliegerische Unzucht, which was aviational unchastity, and I asked him what he'd done. Apparently he'd been a wing commander flying or leading a collection of fighter aircraft, and it was his particular personal sort of amusement was to fly ME-109s, and he would always take off and go under the bridges on the Autobahn, and he would fly through them. And then one day they re-equipped his squadron with ME-110s, and he forgot it had a 20-foot wider wingspan, and he went through and he left 10 feet of the wings on each side at a time when they were desperately short of aircraft material, and the ME-110 was the sort of prized champion that was going to win the war, and that turned out to be aviational unchastity.
How long was he in there for?
I think he told me, well, for a start, you see, they'd stripped him of rank, and I think he was going to be in there for 3 years or something, 3 or 4 years, and we were visited by somebody who I've not heard of since, who was Oberleutnant von Werra, W-E-R-R-A, who apparently was one of the few Germans who ever escaped from a Canadian prison camp and got back. And then he was taken around everywhere to sort of look at the victims to see how it all compared.
I think he was killed towards the end of the war.
He was killed towards the end of the war because he was finally given command of a fighter squadron on the East Front, and he ended up with all sorts of decorations hanging around his neck, and finally he was written off.
So from Grandenz you went back to Colditz,
Mm-hmm.
and were you involved in all the any of the theatre side there, or the lectures, or any of the other things that went on in Colditz?
I suppose so, in a peripheral way. But A, I was young. B, it was a largely army camp, and I was a Marine, and there were only 3 or 4 of us. It was a pretty strange environment if your face didn't fit. For example, I don't think that any of us ever got onto the list where we would have been allowed to escape. We were allowed to help, we were allowed to stand and keep watch and that sort of thing, but the slots had all been reserved long before we got there. And I'm not saying that was any grief or anything. It was the right way to do it. We were there, we could help, we could assist, but I think unless we'd found some way of jumping over a 10-foot wall, we were not likely to but we were involved on a day-to-day basis. I used to make ropes and things, and Bosun Crisp was there and he showed me how to make ropes, and between us, the ropes being for dangling out of the windows and getting down somewhere.
Was it still an international camp when you first went there, or had all the other...
No, it was. There were the Dutch, the Poles, and it was intriguing to watch the similarity between the Dutch and Polish officers. Their uniforms all followed much the same trend as the Germans, and because they had nothing much else to do, they would turn up with a much higher outfit of spit and polish than the Germans did, and they looked very important. They're nice guys.
But then they all went off to various camps?
Yes, they were all marched away. I can't really remember whether it was they thought there was going to be more pressure and they would require more spaces for the English, or they wanted to stop us from maintaining an ear to the Dutch and the Belgian contingent. I'm not quite sure.
I think was it the Poles went to Lubeck where you...
Yes,
you
they did, yeah.
So were you involved with the glider scheme at all?
Not really, no. Our involvement would have been exactly what anybody else's was. We were stood at a corner of a staircase and said, if you see some Germans who shouldn't be here, blow a whistle or do whatever. I don't think, to be honest, we even really knew what the hell was going on. It was well concealed and well done.
Talking about the Germans, do you remember much of the Germans there, or many of the Germans there? You mentioned Pupka,
Yes.
who by and large most people seem to have thought was not a bad chap, but then there were people like Eggers and Preem. Preem had gone, I think, by the time you got there. He was one who liked to drink.
No, he was still there,
He was
but
still
again, we're now in the year 2001, and if one is alive, and one has your fingernails and your teeth, and you're 81 years old, and yeah, I'm not in very good shape this morning, but what the hell? If I'd spent 5 years in a similar institution operated by the Russians or the Japanese or pretty well any other nation, I don't think I'd be around. So I have come to respect the Germans. They did. I know a lot of my compatriots would probably disagree with me, but they did in fact comply with the rules of the Geneva Convention. Yes, in any military organization there's someone who steps over the line, but by and large they kept the rules, and they say, I'm here, I have nothing to complain about, I have found the attitude rewarding, I'm in the real estate business, I run a company in the Bahamas, and I've sold a hell of a lot of real estate to Germans. Not as a punishment, but as a reward for their persistence and their politeness, and the fact that they always ask all the right questions.
Very good. So, if we now come to when Colditz was liberated, do you remember much about that? The actual liberation?
I can remember being told that there were some flags being put up on the roof, which obviously I was very much a young subordinate. People had been working it out, and so as the surrender took effect, so flags went out on the roof to try and prevent bombing and that sort of thing. And I can remember seeing the first of the Americans sort of crossing. There was a plane which we could see, and we could see this outfit moving towards us. I met the people who released us, and then in the immediate years after the war, I think there was a good deal of fraternization where people who had been involved in getting us out of Colditz were invited to all sorts of reunions and things. But down the years, that's gone.
And do you remember actually leaving Colditz? I think you're all carted off in lorries to an airfield somewhere.
Yes, we were hauled off in trucks. We were allowed to go on a walk for one afternoon, and any thought that we would all have a jolly time roistering around the boozers, and that was all wrong. We didn't have $1, and it was, but it was an amusing opportunity to see the place. A small village in the middle of nowhere really had escaped the worst of World War II. And then we were driven off to some airfield, and that was the first time we met the Dakota, and we were crowded in there and flown back to England.
And did you stay in the Marines afterwards, or did you come?
No, I served on for years, until 1967 when I retired, and the tie I am wearing is the 40 Commando tie, and I commanded 40 Commando from 1960 to 1963 while we were in Malta and Singapore and Borneo and all around the place. No, I stayed on as a career officer.
And you didn't regret it at all?
No, I didn't regret it. I don't think it helped my promotion prospects, but I suppose I was reasonable. I got a command, so what the hell?
Were you in Colditz when the commandos were brought there? The
Yes.
Norwegian ones?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't a thing to be then, was it?
Not only that, but of course some of the British military writings directed at training these people were found by the Germans, and then they translated it into their well-known pamphlet about escaping is no longer a sport, it will be punished by death, and which I think was a way of trying to wriggle out of murdering 30 or 40 RAF officers. But no, I don't know. I think I'm lost on that one.
Well, thanks ever so much for putting up with me this afternoon. I know you haven't been feeling at your best, but it's very, very interesting and it's absolutely fascinating. So thank you ever so much.
Great.